It's me, your money. Let's talk, shall we? Ooh, look, your package came today. I can't wait to find out what we ordered. I'm sure you can't either. Look what I found. Remember this? A penny saved is a penny earned. Hello? Anybody in there? Echoey. Just look at them all. We're rich. I don't like the word hoarder. I prefer the term saving visionary. Who needs a 401k when this buried treasure could be worth something one day? And this. Yes, this. Worth every penny.
So if our money could actually talk, what would it tell us? And every time I've mentioned this topic to people, they're like, oh, I don't think I want to hear that because I think I already know. And what if our money could talk, what would it tell us, assuming it's for us and it was actually trying to help us? Now, for the most part, our response to what our money would tell us would be something like this. Yeah, I know, yeah. Yeah, I should have known, right? You're right, money, thank you, I should have known. No, I shouldn't have. In fact, this is a topic for another day, but the way we manage and handle our money, there's clearly something wrong with us, right? I mean, when you think back over what you've done with money, the money you've wasted, money you've gambled away, drank away, partied away, whatever away, and then you look back and you think, wow, if only, clearly there's something wrong with this. And as Christians, we have our explanation for what's wrong with this. If you're not a Christ follower, I'm sure you have an explanation as well. But nothing perhaps highlights how strange we are, and perhaps how dysfunctional we are, and how we undermine our own success, and in some cases our own happiness, than how we manage or perhaps mismanage our money. Now, the shocker about this whole conversation is not how we would respond to what our money would say, because we could probably predict what our money would say. The shocker in all of this, and I think this is pretty cool, the shocker is how what Jesus said about money parallels what our money would say if our money could talk. The shocker is the parallel between what our money would say if it could talk and what Jesus actually said when he did talk. In fact, you may know this, but Jesus said more about money and possessions specifically than heaven. He gave about 40 parables, 35 parables, depending on how you count them, and 16 or 17 of those parables were about money and possessions. And as far as we know, he never asked anybody for any money, except on one occasion he did ask somebody for a coin. He did a coin trick. Actually, it wasn't a trick, it was an illustration. And then we think he gave the coin back. So what was he up to? Why did he talk so much about money? And he was clearly up to something, and he was clearly after something, but as it turns out, he wasn't actually after anybody's money. So let's jump in. What would our money say if our money could talk? Here's something for sure that your money would tell you and my money would tell me. Our money would say, I can add meaning to your life, but I'm not the meaning of life. I can add meaning to your life, but don't be confused, I'm not the meaning of life. Our money would remind us that it rarely gets much attention at funerals, other than related to how much of it was possibly given away. Our money would remind us that it is a much better means. Our money would remind us that it's a much better means than an end. In fact, if you make money the end, you may end up, right, alone. But using money, this is so important, using money and viewing your money as a means to an end is actually what makes your money meaningful. And here's why I say this. It's kind of a larger principle. Being a means to an end is what makes anything meaningful. This is why most of us don't have a Segway, right? Because it's the coolest thing in the world. We just couldn't figure out what to do with it. In fact, apparently nobody could figure out what to do with it. And so we couldn't find any meaning for it. If you've ever ridden one, it's like, wow, I have to have one of these. And, your friend or your husband or wife says, what would you do with it? It's like, I don't know. I would just have to find a purpose, but you couldn't find one. And besides the fact they're expensive. But even if somebody gave it to you, what would you do with it? The thing that makes anything meaningful is the fact that we can figure out how to make it a means to an end. In fact, this is what meaning means. To be meaningful, something has to have an end. It has to be a means to an end. And not only is this true for stuff, this is true, believe it or not, as we're going to discover, for you, for your entire life. If you want to live a meaningful life, and I know you do, if you want to live a meaningful life, you have to figure out a way how to become a means to an end that's not you. And when you decide to be a means to an end, your money becomes a means rather than an end as well. And you will begin to see, in fact, you'll begin to automatically see your money as a tool. And this is exactly what Jesus taught 2,000 years ago in one of his rather famous, I can't believe he said that, parables. Now, just a reminder, a parable is a story that's not true. It's a made-up story to point to something that is true. And Jesus told many of these stories. And whenever he began one of the parables, everybody leaned in, and his closest followers knew two things about his parables. Somewhere in this parable is someone that represents God, and somewhere in this parable is somebody that represents me and you and the people in his audience. And Jesus, again, told so many parables about wealth and possessions and money, and this is one of them. And again, it's a fictitious story in order to make a very, very true point. And here's what he said. Jesus, Luke tells us, and Luke investigated all these things, Jesus told his disciples, and here we go. There was once a rich man. Once upon a time, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So Jesus says there's a rich man. He has so much stuff, he doesn't have time to manage it. And because there was no banking system the way that we think of a banking system, and obviously there was no electronic transfers, everything had to be done manually. So he hired a manager who would buy and sell and trade in his name. He had the authority of the owner. And he got wind of the fact that this manager was doing deals on the side, or wasn't being very frugal or very careful, or wasn't representing him well in the marketplace. So Jesus continues. So this wealthy man, so he called him in, he called the manager in, and he asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account. Give an account, because you're not managing your money, you're not managing your wealth, you're not buying and trading and selling things that you own. You're buying and selling and trading my possessions, so you have to give an account to me of what you're doing with my stuff. Give an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. You're fired. You're fired, but before you go, I need you to wrap up all the unwrapped up loose ends. I need you to finish out whatever deals you're in the middle of doing, and then when you're finished, you bring me the big notebook and leave it here, and you are out of here." And apparently the wealthy man leaves the room, and the manager begins to think. And the manager said to himself, as according to Jesus in this made-up story, the manager said to himself, "What shall I do now?" And this is the point of the parable. What shall I do now? What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm an inside guy. And I'm ashamed to beg. I have my pride. And he finds himself with a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity to ensure that he has somewhere to go and someone to whom to go, someone to go to. He has a little bit of time and he has a little bit of opportunity, and now he's got to figure out, what do I do now so I will have some place to go and I'll have someone to go to. And then he comes up with an idea. Again, back into the parable. I know what I'll do. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, because I just have a little bit of time left, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he comes up with a plan. And here's the plan he came up with. So he called in each one of his master's debtors, and apparently there were a lot of them, because this guy's doing business all over the place. He called in each one of his master's debtors, and he asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And the man who owed his master said, 900 gallons of olive oil is what I owe your master, he replied. And the manager told him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly. Sit down quickly because, well, this needs to happen quickly. I don't have a lot of time. So you need to do this quickly," which is the point of Jesus' parable. Sit down quickly. I only have a little bit of time, and real quickly, make it for 450. It's like, and so this guy's like, wow, like really just half? Yep. And he had the authority to do this, but really half? And so, of course, this gentleman writes out a bill. They work out the arrangement, and before he goes, surely this man leans in and says, "Hey, thank you. Hey, and if you ever need anything, call me." To which a dishonest money manager was thinking, "I will, and sooner than you think." Jesus continues. Then he went to another person who owed his master. He said, then he asked a second, "And how much do you owe?" And this gentleman said, 1,000 bushels of wheat. I owe your master. This guy was massively wealthy. "I owe your master 1,000 bushels of wheat." And the money manager said, "Take your bill and make it 100. Now, the implication is he did this over and over and over. I mean, he just went around to everyone who owed his master any money, and he just kind of, put everything together, finished up all the unfinished business, put it in the big notebook, brought it in, and handed it in. And when his boss, the wealthy guy, found out, you can only imagine, right? So Jesus has everybody leaning in. And Jesus says the master, when he finds out, the master, and of course everybody in Jesus' first century audience thought, we know what happens when this happens. And we know you're making up this story, but hey, there's a touch of realism here. We know what happens when a dishonest manager is caught. This guy's in big trouble. And if you've never heard this parable before or never read it in the New Testament, you would think, wow, he's in trouble. But you see, Jesus is the master storyteller. And Jesus has his first century audience and perhaps his 21st century audience right where he wants us, leaning in, anticipating the end, having already gone there in our minds and in our emotions. We can imagine what we would do if we were a wealthy person who had lost this much wealth because of a dishonest person that we had hired. But if we guessed according to the way we anticipated the story going, we would guess wrong, and so did Jesus' first century audience. The story goes on. Jesus says the master actually commended. He commended he admits dishonest. He commended the dishonest manager. He high-fived him. He grinned. He chuckled. He slapped his knee. He threw his hands up in the air. And the reason he commended him was not because he was dishonest. He commended him because he acted shrewdly. He'd thought it through. He had taken advantage of a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity to secure his own future. He'd thought it through from every angle, and he figured out a way to leverage his little bit of time and his little bit of opportunity to do something to secure his own future. Now, at this point in the parable, Jesus' first century audience, maybe you as well, is confused. It's like, wait a minute, like you're like a rabbi, you're a teacher, you claim to have come from God, and now we're commending somebody who's dishonest. Okay, what is the point of this parable? And that's what Jesus wanted everybody to ask. What's the point of the parable? So at this point, he pulls out of the parable and he begins to teach and to apply the point of this incredible parable. And Jesus says this, now he's addressing his audience and he's addressing you, he's addressing me. He says, for the people of this world. Now, who are the people of this world? The people of this world, in Jesus' way of thinking, are the people who think all there is to life is this life. The people who view life as a bookended by a birth certificate and a death certificate. That what you see is what you get, and all there is to life is this life. The people of this world, the people of this age, the people of this generation, the people of this way of thinking are more shrewd, he would say, or more thoughtful or more forward thinking or more wise in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. And the people of the light were God's chosen people. The people of the light were people who were to live their lives in light of the realness and the existence of God, who are called to live their lives within the context or from the context of eternity, who don't wake up every day thinking all I see, what you see is what you get, and this is all there is, who believe there is life beyond this life. And Jesus says the people of this world who live as if all there is this life are wiser in how they take advantage of their opportunities and their wealth and their time than people of the light. The money manager, his point was simply this. The money manager in the parable was commended for taking full advantage of his limited time and opportunity. And Jesus' point is simply this. My followers, would say, to his first century disciples, his followers, and to us, his 21st century followers, if you're a Jesus follower. His point is, my followers should take a lesson. My followers should take a page out of the playbook of the dishonest manager. My followers should do the same with their limited time and with their limited opportunity. They should be shrewd. They should figure out, how do I limit my limited resources and my limited time and my limited life so that there's something to show for it beyond my life and my time on planet Earth within the broader framework of eternity. And then Jesus gets very specific. In fact, he kind of leans in and he points. And years ago, when I first read this parable and allowed the implications to sink in on me, I felt like Jesus was pointing at me. And it was life-changing for me. And as I'll share in just a minute, it was life-changing for our family. So if you're a Jesus follower, This is my best rendition of trying to take Jesus' hand and his finger and kind of point it in your direction, but this isn't coming from me. This is coming from Jesus. Now, if you're not a Christian, or you're not a Christian anymore, or you don't consider yourself an active Jesus follower, he's not talking to you necessarily. But you are certainly invited to play along, and you're certainly invited to participate. In fact, if you listen to the rest of this parable, I hope you find it so inviting that you might consider for the first time, or maybe for the first time in a long time, following Jesus. Here's what he says. Now he's going to get very direct. He says, I tell you, that's like sit up straight and listen. I tell you, use worldly wealth. In other words, use it because it's a means to an end. It's not the end. Use worldly wealth because it's a tool. Use worldly wealth to do what? To gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, or another way of saying this is when you're gone, when it is gone or when you're gone, because something's going, right? When it is gone, you will be, now this is odd, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. That just as the money manager had a place to go, he said, if you'll use your time and you'll use your opportunity well, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings, which is very odd. In fact, it may seem very strange. In fact, there's no reason in the world to even take this seriously, except for one thing, that Jesus, who talks so much about eternity, Jesus, who did talk on many occasions about heaven, Jesus, who clearly believed there is a God that we can address as Father, punctuated his claims to all of those things, not simply by saying them, but by rising from the dead. And when somebody predicts their own death and resurrection, and then on the other side begins to talk about death and resurrection, you should pay attention. And I should pay attention. And the only reason we should take the eternal aspect of this parable seriously is not because Jesus simply said it, not because it's simply because it's in the Bible, but because the person who said it seemed to have conquered death and punctuated the reality of eternity. And I can't explain it any further than this, so please don't ask me any hard questions, but Jesus is clear. There is a connection between your generosity and my generosity in this life. There is a connection between how we use our limited time and our limited resources in this life and how it impacts eternity. But the bottom line is simply this, that money from God's perspective, money from Jesus' perspective, and you know what? Money from your perspective, when you think about it, money is a means. It's not an end. It's a means to an end that goes beyond us, and Jesus says, beyond this life. The implications are this, that my right now in front of me resources, and that your right now resources can make a forever difference in somebody's life and perhaps in the world. That we can't take it with us. We already knew that. We can't take it with us, but perhaps we can have something to show for it. It is a tool. And if Jesus is right, and I think Jesus is always right, but if you think Jesus is right, here's the big implication. We shouldn't view a percentage of our income or a percentage of our money as something that we should make use of. We should view 100% of what we have as a means to an end. In other words, at some point along the way, and I know this may seem like a threatening question, but it shouldn't be because you don't have to do anything with it, but you should at least consider it. In fact, I think on the other side of this question, there's a lot of freedom, there's a lot of liberty. On the other side of this question, you start living more like this, and you've lived long enough to know this. When you live like this, that's where you find joy. There's no joy like this. This is where the joy is found. If Jesus is right, we should view all that we have as potential means to an end that goes beyond us. And we should ask the question, how? How can I leverage more of what I have? How can I leverage more of what I have? How can I leverage more of what I have as a means to an end that's not me? Now, Sandra and I were so fortunate, and her family's here today. Her parents are here today, so not to keep me honest, but to let you know this, what I'm about to tell you is true. They're sitting right here. Sandra and I were raised in families that had a very similar perspective on money and a very similar perspective on generosity. So it was very easy for us when we got married, easier than many couples, I'll admit, to be generous because we were raised in generous homes. And we decided at the very beginning to live on a percentage of our income. And we decided to give away off the top a percentage of our income to our church and to organizations beyond our church. And we decided that anything we owned should be available for God to use however God wanted to use it. And sometimes that was easy and sometimes it was hard because I'm like everybody else. There's a part of me that just wants to hang on and hold on. And Sandra has been so great through the years to remind me, no, we live open-handed like this. We decided we're not going to hoard stuff. If we're not using it, we want to give it away quick. And you got that box full of stuff and you're headed down to the basement and you're like, wait a minute. If I take this to the basement, it's going to live there for 3 years. And 3 years from now, I'm going to bring it back up and put it into circulation. So let's just give it away now. We decided to live that way. If we're not using it, let's just give it away. And we decided that we would try to say yes to anybody who ever asked us for anything. And again, you can go too far. I'm not advocating irresponsibility. But we decided if we're going to err, we want to err on the side of being too generous, not too ungenerous. And what happened, we didn't know this at the time, what happened, we've been married 30 years, is that we turned stuff into stories. And we don't miss the stuff. And the stories are still emotional for us, like they are for many of you, because many of you have done this as well. Now, here's the thing, and I'll move on. Every time you make a financial decision, you factor something in. You may not even do it consciously, but you have some kind of grid through which you make financial decisions. All I would suggest is this. Would you add one more thing to factor in with every major financial decision? And this is the thing I would love for you to factor in. And this isn't a Christian thing. This is just a thing. Would you factor in this question? Do I want more stuff or do I want more stories? And here's a little hint. At the end of your life, nobody's going to parade your stuff around. They're just going to tell the stories that you created with your stuff. Now, real quick, for all of you at any of our churches around the city or around the country or in different parts of the world, I just want to stop and say something. And to those of you here at Buckhead Church with me today, every time you walk into this building, every time you walk into your building or the school that you're meeting in or wherever you are, for those of you, think about this, for those of you who gave to either rent that school, rent that cafeteria, build that building, remodel that building, get this beautiful building built that we're in at North Point Community Church. I remember all those years ago standing on a hill of dirt on that piece of property and look at what's there now. For anyone who's had any kind of input and was generous to get those buildings built, here's what I don't want you to ever forget. That is a story. And that story is part of your story. And every baptism and every decision for Christ and every marriage that's healed and every prodigal son, every prodigal daughter that comes back, every kid that doesn't walk away from faith, every family that's restored, every single story is part of the story of that organization. And your generosity is part of the story. And they don't know your name and you don't know all their names. But that is part of the story. And here's what I know about you. You don't miss the stuff and you don't miss the money. Because you don't know what you would have done with it had you not given it. But your generosity has made an actual difference in the lives of literally, collectively, thousands and thousands of people. And that elicits joy. That's something to live for. That's something to be grateful for. And it's why every time Sandra and I see a baptism story, every time we walk into one of our buildings, every time we walk through one of our buildings, we are so grateful to have been a teeny tiny part of what is happening just through this organization, not to mention the other organizations you give to and the other organizations our organizations give to. That's what it means to take advantage of your little bit of time and your little bit of opportunity and to leverage it for something that goes beyond you, because your money is a tool and your money is a means. And if you're not careful, you'll use too much of it with you as the end rather than the opportunities that perhaps God has placed in front of you. Or if you're not a Christian, that somebody else or some other extraordinary organization brings your way. But here's Jesus' point in all of this. Money can add meaning to your life. Money can add meaning to your life, but money isn't the meaning. Money isn't the bottom line. The bottom line is something that has to go beyond you. Now, Jesus isn't finished with this teaching either. That's kind of his first point after the parable. He says a couple other things. He goes on to his first century audience. He says this, this is a little confusing, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, okay? And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. Okay, so if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? It's like, okay, I understand what all those words mean, and I understand what all those sentences mean, but I don't know what you mean, Jesus. What are you talking about? Little, much, worldly wealth, true riches? I don't have little, I have a lot. I don't have a lot, I have a little, but they have a lot, but you're acting like everybody just has a little. What is your point? And his point is simply this. And again, it goes back to this eternal perspective, not just with our money, but our whole lives. That our money and our wealth and our possessions, they're not just a tool, they're a test. They're a test that indicates whose kingdom we are most committed to. And Christians live in two different worlds. We have been called to live with our feet firmly planted in this world, caring for this world and caring for the people in this world, but to live in this world with a perspective that goes beyond this world. When Jesus came to planet Earth, it was to introduce the kingdom of God on earth. And we have been invited to live lives with a different kind of perspective, a kingdom perspective. And Jesus said at the end of that parable, in that little teaching I just ran through quickly, hey, by the way, you're like the money manager, and you are accountable for how you spend your money. And at the end of the day, it's kind of a test to see if you are a trustworthy steward. Because at the end of the day, this isn't simply about your kingdom or this kingdom. It's about the kingdom of God. And what you do with what we have indicates whose kingdom we're most devoted to. He continues. And this is kind of the real shocker. We're going to come back to this in part 3. He says, and if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, say, wait a minute, somebody else's property. I mean, that was the parable. That guy, that wasn't his stuff. He was the money manager, but I got my own stuff. I mean, I get a paycheck. I have a deed to my house. I mean, I even have the title to my car. I mean, I got stuff, right? He says, if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who's going to give you property of your own? Again, it's like, wait, somebody else's property? What are you talking about? Well, if your money could talk, your money would team up with Jesus at this point in the teaching, and your money would remind you, hey, by the way, if you've forgotten, I will still be here when you're gone. And the moment you think you own me, I own you. Because you, like the money manager, are a steward. You are a manager. You are not an owner. In fact, you're going to leave it. The fact that you're going to leave it indicates the fact that you couldn't possibly own it, or you would take it with you. But if you're not an owner and you're a manager, here's a question everybody should ask. Who am I managing it for? For who? If you're just stardust, if you're just the product of, evolution through natural selection, but there's no God behind that process, if all there is what we see, if matter is eternal, I mean, if there's nothing outside of what we can see, then I don't know who you're managing it for. But imagine this. Imagine if in the beginning, God actually created the heavens and the earth, and you can pick and choose which method you think he used. But if in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and if he made mankind in his image, and if he entrusted this planet to us, and if we are stewards of the earth, and if you are a steward with a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity, and if God has in fact given you a little bit of time and a little bit of opportunity and a little bit of resources to manage, then my goodness, then what Jesus just taught is extraordinarily true. And you are in fact a manager and not an owner. And Jesus' point is this: come on, manage it well. And don't get confused. Again, if our money could talk, it would remind us, hey, I'm a means. I'm a means. I'm not an end. I'm a tool. And I'm a test. And I can add meaning to your life, but don't be confused. I'm not the meaning of life. So, what do you do with all that? I mean, for some of you, it's inspiring because you've been living this way a long time. For others of you, it's like, well, I know it's true, but I don't know what to do. I mean, I've got bills and responsibilities, and I've got debt, and yeah, in some ideal world, if I had extra and lots of margin, yeah, but what do I do, when this is over? So I want to give you a first step, and we'll talk about this some more next week. I would like you to ask a question that most people never ask, and consequently most people don't have an answer to, but you're not most people. A question that on the surface seems to have nothing to do with money, but once you begin to ask the question, it begins, and once you begin to coming up with answers for this question, it will begin to shape and impact the way you view and use your money And here's the question. If being a means to an end is what gives your life meaning, if being a means to an end is what gives your life meaning, parents, you totally get this. Grandparents, you totally get this. School teachers and coaches, you totally get this. To some extent, all of us get this if we stop and think about it. If being a means to an end is what gives your life meaning, to what ends, plural, because it's not just one, to what ends do you want your life to be a means? You should have answers to this question. If being a means to an end is how you have meaning, to what ends do you want your life, your little bit of time, your little bit of opportunity, your little bit of resources? What ends do you want to be a means to? What do you want people, I've asked you this question before, what would you like people to celebrate about you at the end of your life? What breaks your heart that you're actually doing something about? Or I love Sandra's question when we talked about this years ago. She said, I wonder what I would like people to line up at the end of my life and thank me for. That should direct my time and the little bit of opportunity and time that I have. What would you like people to line up at the end of your life and thank you for? All of those questions kind of funnel into this idea of what do I want my life to be a means to, an end that's not me. And when you know the answer, and once you discover the answer, you will have just discovered something that will ultimately impact your money. And here's the thing. If you don't answer that question, if you don't decide for yourself, culture will decide for you. Your appetites will decide for you. And I know what your answer isn't. And I don't know you by name, and I don't know really anything about many of you, and I certainly don't know those of you on the other end of a camera, but here's what I know your answer isn't. Your answer isn't accumulation, consumption, upgrades, fashion forward, a house full of stuff. I mean, that's not the end. You don't want your story to be she ate, she drank, she was merry, then she died. Let's bury her, right? Here's the thing, and I'm almost finished. When you answer, and I hope you will, when you answer the big question, your money will follow. But if you never answer the big question, you may spend the rest of your life following your money. And your money was never designed to be an end. It's a means to an end. You have an opportunity to choose what that end is. And when you choose it, your money will begin to follow. See, to get this wrong is such a shame because here's something we all know. I'm just going to put words around something you know. And you've seen, you know people like this. You've seen people get to the end like this, and you thought to yourself, not me, not me, not me. But if you live for yourself, you'll only have yourself to show for yourself. Along with some stuff for people to fight over when you're gone. So this week, I just want you to think. I don't want you to make a financial decision because it's bigger than that. I just want you to wrestle with the question. If being a means to an end is what gives my life meaning, to what ends do I want my life to be a means? You should have an answer to this question because ultimately this will direct your money. This will direct your emotion and your passion, and this will direct your priorities because you've just discovered a priority. And when you identify the answer to this question and when you embrace it, the meaning of your life will direct the direction of your money as it was intended to be. What are the ends to which you want your life to be a means? And what would it look like to think in terms of how can I make 100% of what I own, what I manage, what comes my way, more available, more directly involved in the things that are actually most important to me? And if you're a Jesus follower, this isn't optional. Because Jesus said, use your worldly wealth to make friends for yourself on the other side of this life. Now, the interesting thing about the parable and the teaching that followed the parable is that as Jesus wrapped up, Luke, who said he thoroughly investigated all these things, says that Jesus' closest followers, his disciples, were not the only people in the crowd. Here's how Luke finishes this passage. He says, the Pharisees who loved money, it was an end for them. The Pharisees who loved money heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. And do you know what their names were? No. Me neither. Nobody does. Let's not be those guys. We'll pick it up there next week. Heavenly Father, just give us eyes to see. Just give us eyes to catch a glimpse. Not of somebody else's opportunity, not of somebody else's potential, our potential. And Father, help us to begin to see everything, not money that we give, just to see it all, the way that you see it. And Father, speaking for me, I just don't want to miss the opportunity. They come and they go so quickly. Life goes by so quickly. So just give us wisdom to know what to do with what we've heard, to pay our bills, to take care of our kids, to save for college, all the stuff, the blocking and the tackling, but to be able to step back and say, but what if? And what would it look like if I began to think this way? Thank you for the invitation to step into a bigger world and to step into bigger potential, because you've called us to that. And Father, for the person who's not actively a Jesus follower, I pray there would be something about this just intriguing enough to get their interest, and perhaps one day to say yes to you with their whole life. And we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week for part 2 of Money Talks. Have a great week.